Well, hey, Red Letter Disciple, Zach Zender back with you, host of the Red Letter Disciple, bringing Chris Johnson, my friend and co-host, on in just a moment, and we together welcome Chad Bird onto the Red Letter Disciple podcast. And I love Chad coming on because he fits the mission of this podcast, which is to help you be a greater disciple of Jesus. If you're a pastor, it's not only help you, but it's to help the people in your church be a greater disciple, because we believe that when we are the great disciples, that's the greatest potential we can live up to, that the world will really change when we live that out. So Chad helps us with that today as we dive into the Old Testament. Chad is an Old Testament scholar, and he actually teaches us discipleship not through a guy named Jesus, but through a guy named Jacob. Now, again, he's not going to knock Jesus, and he knows that we can learn a lot of discipleship from Jesus, but he also believes and teaches that we can learn some discipleship stuff from the Old Testament. And so I can't wait to dive in on that, and especially why Jacob, who in my estimation is one of the worst dudes of the Bible, like what in the world can we learn from him? Plus, we're going to learn more about the Old Testament, the beautiful ways in which Jesus shows up. And I get asked a lot as a pastor, maybe you do too, how do you know if any of the laws or rules of the Old Testament still apply to us today? I love this answer for that. You're going to hear that later. And so today's episode is brought to you by Children's Hope Chest. It's a powerful organization that's doing great work overseas, and I love their model. I've seen it firsthand, and we support them financially and with our family through our church. They have an amazing model where they partner with churches and communities across the world in a long-term partnership that's very heavy on relationship and empowerment of the community. But the way they do this is through multiple mission trips and, of course, through sponsoring kids. And it's two-way transformation that ends up happening. That village or that community really does change, but also those of us who support it financially and with boots on the ground and mission trips also change as well. And so it's a really amazing helping without hurting model. And if you want to learn more about it, if you know you need to get in the game globally, because every church has a global call as well, I really believe, attached to it, and you want to learn more about their model and what it looks like, the next step for you is to get on a vision trip. They have some summer vision trips coming up, and they're going to 3 different places this summer: Guatemala, Uganda, and Ethiopia, and maybe one of those is right for you. So you can check out and get more information on what a vision trip looks like before you sink fully into this. Check it out, Pastor, for yourself. I think you're going to be wowed. I know I was when I went. You can go to hopechest.org/Lutheran. Anybody can go there, but that's a page where specifically they talk about all the Lutheran churches that are involved with Hope Chest and the amazing work that God's doing in our denomination, the one that I'm a part of. And so hopechest.org/Lutheran. And before we get to Chad today, if you haven't yet, doesn't take long. Just spend a couple seconds smashing that plus button or the thumbs up or whatever it might be, and follow this show so that it shows up for you every week, and send a rating or review our way. That means the world to us and really allows us to know that we're on the right track. So that'd be awesome if you could do that for us. All that being said, without further ado, let's do this. Alrighty, we have a great episode today. We're going to talk some theology today with one of the great theologians, Chad Bird. He's a scholar in residence at 1517. He's served as a pastor, a professor, and lecturer.
Just so you know, that's a great website for resources for pastors, 1517.org.
1517.org. Chad holds master's degrees from Concordia Theological Seminary, Hebrew Union College. He writes articles to Christianity Today, Gospel Coalition, Modern Reformation, Lutheran Forum, so many others. He's also the author of several books. I got a couple of them here with me, including The Christ Key and Limping with God. So we're going to talk a little bit probably about the Limping with God one more so today, because it's all about Old Testament discipleship, and I'm intrigued by that. So Chad, welcome to Red Letter Disciple. How is the day going for you today?
Oh, it's great. Doing well. Been looking forward to the conversation with you guys.
Yeah, we are pumped to have you on, and you are an expert theologian. And so I just want to start with, for you, like, where did the love of theology come from?
You know, I never remember a time when I wasn't in church. My parents, my mom and dad were both churchgoers. I was raised Southern Baptist, so we were in church like all the time, which was as a kid, you know, you don't really like it, but as an adult, you're like, thanks be to God that I was in Sunday school every Sunday. I was Sunday morning service, Sunday night service, was there all the time. But you know, being raised in a tradition like that, I had the Bible in front of me all the time. And so from infancy, like Paul says, from infancy, I was learning the scriptures. Well, I was too. I was learning about Joshua and the conquest of the promised land and the crossing the Red Sea. And so, I mean, early on, I drank deeply of the milk of the word. And that engendered within me just this interest in scriptures. And then over time, I mean, you grow up, you start to ask more questions, you get to struggle with various teachings. And so you begin to think theologically, what's God telling us here about himself, or what's he telling us about who we are, and how do we follow him as disciples? So the older you get, the more you begin to really think deeply theologically about who you are, your place in the world, what's wrong with you, who God is, who Christ is. And so I've always kind of been this growing theologian, which I still am, and we're always growing in our understanding of who God is. But it began real early on for me, those early years.
And was it a pretty, with where you are today, has it been a pretty linear path, or kind of walk me through your journey to get to where you are today, to now where you're, a constant contributor and writer in so many different ways, and lecturer, speaker on this. So yeah, walk me through a little bit of your path to how you got to where you are.
Yeah, I'm not alone in this, but I certainly have embodied the idea of God. God writes straight with crooked lines. Been a lot of crooked lines in my life. A lot of one step forward and two or three or four, 5 steps back. So it certainly has not been linear in my case. Now, I feel like it started out that way. I mean, I grew up in church, always stayed in church in my high school years, and then went right out of high school. I went on to a Christian college. I went on to a seminary. I was a pastor for a few years. I came back and I taught at the seminary for a while, taught Hebrew, taught Old Testament courses. So, I mean, there was somewhat of a linear progression there. But then in my mid-30s, my life completely, I don't know if you want to say exploded or imploded, but after all was said and done, I look around me at the shards of my once put together life, and it was just a royal mess. And that was really, in my opinion, that was really when God began to teach me what it means to be a theologian. Even though I didn't know it at the time, I didn't like it at the time, but I entered into about a 10-year, pretty dark period in my life where I was angry at God, afraid of God, attracted to God, thought God hated me, fought with God, ran from God. All of those kind of things were happening in my life over the course of that time. And really, what God was doing with me as a theologian, he was breaking me down. He was tearing me apart, and then gradually beginning to put me back together, with all the cracks still showing. So that was a very formative and a very painful period of my life, but I learned a lot about myself. I learned a lot about the love of Christ, and I learned a lot about what it means to be a disciple. And then, having gone through that difficult time and not realizing more difficult times were still to come, I did begin to focus a lot more in my own teaching and writing at that time about what it means to be a broken and limping disciple, which of course we're going to talk about when we're going to get to the book. But that period shaped me by unshaping me from who I thought I needed to be to who actually God wanted me to be.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of people that, that when they start to follow God, they do think it's a linear progression, and maybe it is for a little while, and then all of a sudden, boom, like you said, my life was in shambles. And it's like, why? Like you kind of walked the path that you were supposed to walk, if you will. And so maybe talk to the person out there that that is looking around at whatever they're going through right now, and they're wondering, like, why am I in this? If I'm trying to follow Jesus and I'm trying my best to walk out my faith, is everything around me in, I think you said, shards. And so maybe talk to that person right now that's going through that, because your story's not it's not yours alone. It's many others. I mean, you have your story, but many others are walking that similar path, and they might be in that now. So what can you tell them kind of on this side of walking through that or limping through
Yeah,
it?
I think one of the first and foremost things to realize is that it probably will feel like either God is absent from your life or that God is actively against you. Neither of those are true. We have a God who loves us, whose impulse is always to move toward us in grace and mercy, and never to turn his back on us. Now, our situation might say otherwise. Our emotions are certainly going to scream otherwise. But if you can, hear that consistent, soft, faithful voice of Christ is saying, I am here. I love you. I'm going to get you through this no matter what. Now, that doesn't mean that everything is going to be wonderful. It's not going to be. It's going to hurt. It's going to be a long process. But I will say this: we worship a God who promises to be faithful and is always faithful to us. He was to me. He has been to countless generations of Christians. So know it's going to be a slow process, but know in the midst of this process that Christ is going to remain faithful, loving, gracious, and forgiving to you. And even though you might not realize it now, there will come a time when you look back, as I did, and say, oh, now I see what he was doing. Oh, now I understand how his hidden hand was active in my life to teach me in my weakness about relying on his strength, to teach me in those times when I felt on the brink of despair that he was my only hope. Sometimes it's only when we are at that bottom place where we realize that the one that we needed all along was right there with us. And he reveals himself to us in those difficult times in order that we might see more clearly that he is our all in all, always has been, always will be, but sometimes we're blind to that fact.
Yeah. Hey, Chad, I have a question, because I think a lot of people have gone through what you've gone through, where, maybe they were raised in the faith, and had kind of their life together, and then some kind of event happens, and then, as you described it, you went through years of being angry, fearful, all these things, different emotions you had toward God. Can you point to something during that kind of, as you described it, a period of darkness that kind of brought you back? Like, what was it that brought you back to the faith?
Yeah, so there's a story behind this. So I went from being a truck driver, from being a seminary professor to a truck driver, which is a bit of a shift in occupation.
Yeah, yeah.
But I did this because I wanted to live where my kids were. I went through a divorce, wanted to live where my kids were. And remarkably, the area of the country I was in, the Texas Panhandle, there was not a high need for Hebrew professors in that area. I checked the want ads, nothing was there. I was like, well, I guess I'll get my CDL so I can put food on the table. So I did. I started driving a truck, which was a pretty interesting change. But what happened was I worked the night shift. I'd be out there in the middle of nowhere. I was in the oil and gas fields, hauling wastewater away from gas wells, and I'd get stuck. When it rained, everything was messy out there, and you get stuck quite frequently. Well, when you get stuck, you wait, sometimes hours, for a bulldozer to come and pull you out. Well, one night I got stuck. It was probably 2 a.m. I knew it was going to be there for a while. So I turned on the light above my seat, and I always carried a copy of the Book of Psalms with me, just to have it. I didn't use it much, but just to have it. But that night, I had all this time on my hands, and so I pulled it out, turned the light on, and I started to pray the Psalms. Now, keep in mind, I had been a professor of Hebrew and Old Testament. It wasn't like the Psalms were something I'd never looked at before,
Right.
or something that I'd never prayed before. I had. But sometimes there's parts of Scripture that it's like, when you're in a certain season of life, it's like you've never seen this before. It hits you so hard. It speaks to you in a way that never spoke to you before. And the Psalms did that for me that night. It was like Jesus was sitting over there in the passenger seat praying these along with me. I went from Psalm 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, began to just pray these consistently. And I realized that here was the language that I was missing. I didn't know how to talk to God. I mean, how do you talk to someone where you don't know if they love you or they hate you, whether they're attacking you or comforting you, whether they're sick of you or whether they're desiring you back? How do you talk to someone like that?
Right.
Well, I didn't know. But the Psalms all of a sudden gave me the words to say. I could be angry. I could be frustrated. I could be lonely. I could say all these things in the Psalms that I wouldn't have even dared to pray. Some of this language is so bold and brash in the Psalms that it's really shocking you can speak this way to God. But I did that, and that was the first step toward healing.
Wow.
Because it gave me a means whereby I could actually voice what was going on inside me in such a way that I knew God would hear and answer, and he did. So I think in that way the Psalms they saved my life. They put me back at least on the track to where God wanted me to be.
That's an amazing story.
That's great.
Thank you.
And I love that. And I think that too many people don't know that, like, it's the word of God. So the word of God is giving you words that you can speak back to God, right?
Yes.
I think one of the
Yes.
ones that really stands out to me in Psalm is Psalm 88. It's like maybe the
Oh, yeah.
deepest and the darkest. I think it might be the only Psalm that kind of like doesn't resolve itself at the end. It's like
Yeah.
he ends
Yeah.
with like, darkness is my closest friend. Whereas a lot of them end with like, and yet I'll praise you, Lord, and yet you are my rock, you know. But this
Oh,
one,
yeah. Yeah.
like a really powerful one to just remind us, like, God can handle whatever it is we bring to him. I just think the biggest lesson in all of that is we still come to him, right? And he can
Yes.
handle whatever words and language we have, even if it's off color or frustrated or angry or in a
Absolutely.
place where we're stuck at 2 a.m. waiting for a bulldozer. And
Mm-hmm.
our
Yeah.
life.
Yeah.
Powerful.
How long did you drive a truck?
For about 13 years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Yeah. So what happened was I drove in the oil field for about 3 years. I got a job in the freight business, and I drove for them for almost 10 years. And then during that time, I started doing a little bit of writing. This was back when blogging was all the rage. And so I got a
Yes.
blog, and I started doing a little blogging, and that opened up opportunities for me that I never saw coming. Just to kind of back up a little bit. So I'm married to my wife, Stacy, and she and I prayed early in our marriage that God would, whatever he wanted me to do, that we just told him, open up the door for me. Because early in my life, I had everything planned and plotted out. So I let God know my plans. Here's what I'm going to do, God. And it actually worked out until it didn't work out and everything blew up. So in this other phase of my life, I was like, you know what? I'm not going to do anything. I'm not going to knock on any doors. I'm not going to try and push any doors open. Whatever you want me to do, just please open the door and push me through it, God. And that started happening. I started blogging, and 2 publishers reached out to me with book deals. I didn't
Wow.
reach out to them. They reached out to me. Erdman's reached out, and then later Baker offered me a 2-book contract. I didn't reach out to them. I didn't send in a book proposal, nothing.
Well, that's
So
pretty
the impetus
rare.
came from them.
Yeah.
So I started to do then I started, writing books, and I got connected with the people at 1517 around that same time. Started doing a little bit more of work for them, but I was still driving a truck full time. I just got up at 4 every morning and did a little bit of writing, and then I went off to work and did that for, I don't know, probably 4 years before I really got on full time with 1517. But I drove a truck, for about 13 years.
Wow.
That's cool. And yeah, what an amazing door that was opened through just blog writing. That's really cool. So now you're writing a lot about theology, and I would imagine everything you went through, there's like a depth to it and some new understanding that is baked into your writings that is even more powerful. So as you look out, like, we have a lot of pastors listening, and there's so many people that still self-identify as Christian in our nation, but I don't know that means much anymore. The feeling I'm getting more and more is that the common person, even in our churches, is really infantile in their faith and their understanding of Christ. And so I guess I'm wondering, is that what you're feeling? Am I wrong on that? Like, where are people at with their with theology and their understanding of God these days?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty accurate description of what I encounter too. Of course, cultural Christianity is kind of the thing, and I'm beginning to pick up a little bit more and more of that. You'll hear people talk about how I'm not a Christian, but I like the culture of Christianity. So I don't know all the implications of that, but I know they're not good as far as theology goes. I like what Christianity can do for me, but I don't really care for, I don't know, Jesus. So you got that going on. But even among people who are in church, who claim the name Christian, I encounter a lot of folks who just the rampant biblical ignorance. They're believing things about Jesus that basically are heresies. And I'm not saying this is willful. They just don't realize. I mean, you'd be amazed how many people I encounter, talk with, have interact with online, this is just one example, who believe that the incarnation was an internship. that the Son of God came down from heaven. He became one of us for 33 years, and that's it. He ceased being a human when he ascended back to the Father, and now he's just fully God. So being fully God and fully man was only a 33-year experiment on the part of Jesus. I mean, that I literally, every time I talk about this, I get reactions from people who are shocked, like this is the first time that they've heard this. That's a core doctrine of who Christ is, and yet it's not known. I don't know if it's not being taught or what it is, but it's just not known in the churches. I mean, that's one example among many. There's a lot of opportunities out there for some kind of basic teaching, and then certainly for some deeper teaching that is just direly needed in our churches.
So how do you wrestle with that then? Like if you're, if you are a pastor and like you have a flock of people that you're serving, and you recognize that there is basic teaching needed and there is deep teaching needed. What would be kind of your recommendations on how do we bring, both sides of that theology? And
I think that
wrong with that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you've got to provide opportunities for people. Maybe you have to start by training people that are going to be able to help you out. You got to teach them either the elementary or the deeper things in order that they can assist you in reaching the rest of the congregation. And you got to take every opportunity you can to do this kind of teaching, whether it's in sermons or whether it's in Bible class or whether it's in small groups or meeting in people's houses, whatever it is. I think I think sometimes we sell people short. I think they actually want to learn. I think there is a desire that people have. They just need to be given that chance to learn, to be exposed to good theology, to be exposed to good teaching. I think sometimes we think, people they kind of want it, kept simple and shallow. I don't really think so. At least what I encounter when I travel in the country teaching, people are eating up Old Testament Christology, for instance, or they're eating up talk about the incarnation or whatever it is that I'm teaching about. They love this. They want to learn. They want to grow. They just need to be exposed to as much of this as we can. And I think part of the struggle for pastors is, I mean, you've got folks who 6 days a week, 6.5 days a week are being taught. They're being taught theology. Maybe they don't really think of it as theology, but they're being taught how to think about God, how to think about themselves. And they're being taught that you're nothing more than a consumer. That's your identity. And what's going to make you fulfilled in life, acquiring stuff. Or you can be taught that, you're just a sexual being. And what's really going to give you fulfillment is satisfying your sexual appetite. I mean, that's being fed to people nonstop. Well, that's a kind of theology. That's a kind of, we might say, pagan theology. So people are being theologized 24/7. And so pastors and teachers are here struggling to get people to realize that, and then to also give them the good theology instead of this misleading theology that they're being exposed to.
It's good. All right, let's start to give them some good I mean, we already are, because all of this is theology, but let's get into it a little bit more. This is a Red Letter Disciple. I'm all about a discipleship guy, and my answers for discipleship is like, we've made it way too complicated. Like, just listen to Jesus and do what he says. Like, that's a pretty good disciple. So my answer is always look to Jesus. But then you wrote a book about how we can learn discipleship from an Old Testament guy named Jacob. And my wife and I were talking about Jacob the other day. She did a book study on Malachi, and she was teaching it. And, there's a verse in there, Jacob I've loved and Esau I have hated. And she was looking at it more at Jacob. And like, this guy seems to be one of the biggest scoundrels in the Old Testament. I don't know that there's anything good about him at all. And so when I ran across your book, I'm like, now this is an interesting concept, that we can learn discipleship from a guy named Jacob when I'm trying to tell people you should learn from Jesus. So tell me why Jacob is a good person we can learn discipleship from.
Yeah, that is a great question. And I love your wife's insight, because Jacob is a scoundrel. There is no doubt about it. He's a backstabber. He's a liar. He takes the Lord's name in vain. He's got a messed up family. He's not that great of a husband. He's a terrible father. I mean, we could go on and on. The guy is just a royal mess. And that's one of the reasons, actually, that I wanted to write the book about him, is because I look at Jacob's life, and I see so much of Jacob that I don't like. And one of the reasons I don't like it is because it's such a mirror of my own soul. Like, this guy,
Right.
which part of life is he not messed up in? He's a bad husband. Well, I have not been a great husband myself. He's a bad father. Well, I've messed up bringing my children up too. He's this, he's that. And yet, this is the real beauty of Jacob's life. And yet, you look at this guy, and even though he's got nothing attractive about him for God to choose him, that's who God chooses. God chooses this scoundrel, this weak guy, this guy who just fallen all over himself, messing up. And God says to him, Jacob, you're the guy I choose, not your brother Esau, whom I think is a better guy. I actually think Esau is a pretty cool guy.
Right.
I mean, I would trust Esau with my stuff.
He just
more
made
than I would trust Jacob
in the world, but other than that, he's a good guy, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So God chooses him and says, I love you. I'm going to bless you. I'm going to be with you. And he is. And that's remarkable. So Jacob remains, for me anyway, this great illustration of God's upside down sorts of ways. God doesn't look around. He's like, okay, I'm going to pick the guys that are, the best, the cream of the crop, the guys who have their act together, the moral examples. I'm going to choose them, and then they're going to be my disciples. God almost goes out of his way to be like, let's see, who's the worst guy here?
Yes, absolutely.
There's Jacob. I'm going to grab him. He's going to be my guy. And then you see another reason I like him as a disciple example is because you see how even when he goes through all of these screw ups in his life, God is still able to bring good out of it. Even when he steals his brother's the blessing of the firstborn for his brother. I mean, what a nightmare of a chapter. He got his mom's playing favorites. She's coming up with a scheme. All Jacob's worried about is getting caught. You got poor blind Isaac who doesn't even know what's going on half the time. And you've got Esau who's just had his whole future stolen from him. So you read this story and you get to the end of it and you realize, oh, I guess in the midst of this entire mess, God's will was done because now the older will serve the younger. So that's just one illustration from the life of Jacob.
Yeah.
Where you got a guy who's just, goodness gracious, what a handful. And yet that's the guy that God ends up using and blessing. And as I like to point out, his family, this dysfunctional mess, 4 women he's married to, get all these kids who are half brothers and half sisters, jealous of each other, stabbing each other in the back. That's the Old Testament church, at least the nucleus of it right there. This is it. This is the holy, and if you're just listening to this, that's in air quotes, holy family of Jacob's little entourage of a mess. So I don't know. I find great comfort in it because I'm glad that God chose a guy like Jacob and a families like Jacob's instead of the family that is like do no wrong, that just the best, because I can't identify with them. I can identify with Jacob in ways that I wish I couldn't identify with Jacob.
Right. I don't always want to identify, but I do. So the book title is Limping with God. So tell me a little bit about that analogy and how limping and discipleship can go together.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite Bible chapters is Genesis 32. That's a story of Jacob wrestling with God. So a bit of the context for those who might not have read that in a while. Jacob has just got back from 20 years of exile. He had to flee when he stole the birthright, the blessing rather. He comes back. He's got this big family. He's got all this stuff. And the next day he's going to have a reunion with Esau. But that night he's alone. And this random dude, at least we think it's a random dude at first, just jumps him in the dark and they begin to wrestle. Well, as the story goes on, he realizes this random dude is none other than God himself, who's taken on a temporary human form to wrestle with Jacob. And maybe we can get into this later in the conversation, but I think it's Jesus. I think this is the Son of God, the pre-incarnate Christ, who's doing this. So you got Jacob wrestling with Jesus.
I'm sorry to interrupt. A lot of people have asked me as a pastor, who was that? Was it Jesus? Was it God? Was it an angel of the Lord? And I'm like, I don't know. Yes. Yeah. Yes. So,
I think it is because it fits within a whole cluster of appearances of God in the Old Testament, where sometimes he's called the messenger of the Lord. or sometimes just a man. He appears in different sorts of ways. So he's sent by God, but he's called God.
Mm.
So you have a sender and the one who's sent, but yet the one who's sent is also referred to as God or calls himself God, as in this case. Well, that fits perfectly within our Trinitarian theology because the Father sends the Son, and he who has seen the Son has seen the Father. So this is, I would argue, this is Christ in the Old Testament appearing to and wrestling with Jacob. Now, during this wrestling match, you also realize that God doesn't fight fair, because he dislocates Jacob's hip while they're doing this wrestling match. God doesn't operate according to our rules. You can make up any rules you want to for God. He's not going to keep those. Turns out he's above the law. He's not. He's certainly not going to keep our rules and our laws. So he doesn't fight fair. So now Jacob is he's got a dislocated hip, but when this is all said and done, God actually willingly loses to Jacob. That's the true beauty of this, because he gives a new name to Jacob. He says, you're going to be Israel now. And the reason God gives for Israel, he says, because you have fought or striven with God and with man and have prevailed. You've won. I always compare this to be like if you're a dad and you've got a 4-year-old son at home and you're wrestling, well, you're going to like throw the kid down and pin him every time? Of course not. You're going to let him win, right? That's the fun of it.
Yeah.
Well, this is God letting Jacob pin him, letting Jacob win. God willingly loses in order that his people might win. And the result is that Jacob gets the most awesome name ever, Israel, God fighter. And so we have this whole encounter. There's a lot more to this, but we have this whole encounter, and then Jacob limps away from that. So he's touched by God, and as a result of God's touch, he limps away, in order that he now realizes, because of this limp that he has, that it's in his weakness that he finds his strength. It's in being touched or wounded by God that he remembers this encounter with God. And as I like to put it, he has to learn now how to be a good steward of his wound, or a good steward of his scars, which is a direct plug into our life as disciples, where we limp our way through life, or we carry a wound, or we have a scar, and this scar is a direct result of our sin, somebody else's sin, something that has happened to us, God touching us, whatever it is. Now God says, I want you to be a good steward of that scar. Mm-hmm. I want you to use that to love and to serve others who are around you, to comfort others, as Paul says, to comfort others with the same comfort with which you yourself have been comforted by God. And in that way, as we limp along through life as disciples of Jesus, we realize that it's in our woundedness, in our weakness, in our scarredness, that we learn how we can best serve those who are around us.
Yeah, it's cool. And I love that imagery too. And, even that was one of that scar imagery is one of the core images in my book, Forgiving Challenge, that I just couldn't get out of my head, of like the post-resurrected body of Christ still has scars in his hands, and like scars tell stories. And so, yeah, we don't necessarily like the fact that we have to have a scar, but that scar can tell a story. And that's a beautiful thing. And Jacob's certainly got a good story to tell, with a lot of ups and downs. And as he's limping along, he gets a lot of people to listen. So you're an Old Testament guy. Jacob's obviously Old Testament. What more can we learn about just discipleship in general from the Old Testament? Sometimes it feels like, especially to the kind of the everyday follower, like the Old Testament and New Testament are somewhat related, but not super related, if that makes sense. Or that now there's the New Testament, we don't maybe need the Old Testament as much. It's still important, but maybe not as important as, the Gospels or the New Testament. And so just talk a little bit about, the importance of the Old Testament. And if you can tie it with discipleship, that'd be great.
Yeah. So just to tie those directly together, one of the primary problem that Israel faced. So if you begin already back in Exodus and then trace it all the way forward, there's one recurring issue with Israel. It's the perennial issue. It's the foundational issue with them, and that is that they always turn from God to something else. call it idolatry, call it whoring after other gods. I mean, there's all kinds of images that are used throughout the Old Testament for this, but that's the core issue. Now, that actually gets to the very heart of what discipleship is. What does Jesus say? Does he say, come and follow this set of doctrines? No, or come and follow this liturgical system, or come and follow this whatever, fill in the blank. No, he always says, I want you to follow me. So discipleship is all about following in the footsteps of our Lord. And that's Old Testament to the core. God calls us to walk after him, to follow him, to stick with him. And that's where Israel always went astray. What Israel always wanted to do was to follow Yahweh and Baal, Yahweh and Asherah, whatever it might be. They really never wanted to just follow God alone. They always had these other things they wanted to follow. And God was always like, no, listen. He's like, he gets their face in his hands and he's like, listen, look at me, pay attention. If you follow me, everything will be actually better for you. And the Israelites are like, no, we want to follow you and something else. So that actually teaches us a lot about what it means to be a disciple. We follow our Lord where he leads us. Even if he leads us in places that seem really strange to us, even if he leads us in places that seem directly contrary to what we think we should be doing, if you follow God, then you're always going to be going in the right direction, even if it feels like the wrong direction to you. Mm. And my goodness, the disciples had to realize that. I mean, when they're following Jesus to Jerusalem and he kept talking about being arrested and crucified, I'm sure they were like Peter, like, what are you talking about? Well, why would you want to go this direction then? Why are we going to Jerusalem? And yet that's where he needed to be. So to follow Jesus, even to the cross, is the place to be, or to follow Jesus into areas of our lives that we don't feel comfortable is the thing to do. Because when you're with Jesus, you're always safe. No matter what's happening around you, you're safe in the sense that you know that you're where God wants you to be and where God can use you. And that was a hard lesson for Israel to learn. It's a hard lesson, of course, for us still as disciples today to learn, but that's what it's all about.
Yeah. So in the Old Testament, it's follow Yahweh, and you mentioned Baal, Asherah, household gods, whatever the and might be. I think some of the problem we're living with in our day, which I'd love your take on this, is we still do that. Follow Jesus, yes. And I think a lot of the ands that we've tried to follow, though, are not necessarily bad things, but they're good things. Yes. And obviously, when any good thing becomes the primary thing, it becomes a bad thing and a dangerous thing. But what are some of the ands that you're recognizing that people are following today that, we may look back at the Old Testament and be like, how stupid they could be to follow Baal or make a gold statue or keep these little household gods on a mantle? Like, I would never fall for that. Yet I feel like we are. So,
yes.
Yeah. What is that a true take? Are we still doing that? And then what are some of the ands that you're recognizing in our world today?
Yeah, we tend to ultimatize that which is secondary or tertiary in our lives. We take that which is second or third or fourth in importance, whatever it is, and we bump it up to number one. And like you point out, a lot of these are good things. I mean, you can make we'll start with this one. You can have Jesus and family. I mean, it's pretty easy for even this wonderful gift of family to be put at the number one spot, where we fear, love, and trust in various ways those closest to us more than we actually love Christ. But to start with, one I think is actually way prevalent in our society today, and I think it's going to become increasingly so, Jesus in politics. I mean, a lot of people who maybe they're religious or maybe they consider themselves non-religious, they have made a religion out of their politics. This becomes their church. Their church is they're a Democrat or they're independent or they're Republican or whatever it is, that's their group. And they have a dogma. They have doctrines attached to this, things you should believe, things you shouldn't believe. They have sometimes rituals or icons or whatever attached to this. The whole religious system wrapped up in politics. And therefore they will add politics to Jesus. And in that way, you make an idol out of politics. And it's never, by the way, it never ends up like Jesus and whatever's in the blank is secondary. Whatever's is in second place is always in first place.
Yeah.
So if it's Jesus and politics and Jesus is really what it's all about. or if it's Jesus and your job, it's actually your job and Jesus is what it's all about. We always bump up what's in second place to first place. But I mean, to take some obvious ones, I mean, we are in such a consumerist society that, call it whatever, riches, money, possessions, mammon, to use the old language, that's the idol at the core of our culture. I just on Sunday in Bible class, we were sitting around talking about what it's like to live in our society, in our economic society. And it came up how, we are bombarded constantly by the message that basically says, you're not going to be happy, you're not going to be enough until you have this object, or until you have this product, or until you look this way. And so on a deep psychological level, we are schooled from infancy onward to believe that unless I have such and such, I will not be a complete human being. I will not be happy. I will not be enough until I have this. And that then becomes the defining goal of a lot of people's lives, to get stuff, because in that stuff they think they're going to find fullness and rest. And of course, it never happens. I mean, those are some examples.
Yeah, no, it's really
You
good.
can make idols out of a lot of things.
Yeah, and I think for the pastors that are listening to, to tack on to what you said, I think we have to be really careful that we don't have Jesus and church, Jesus and denomination. And I think that's so easy for us, to do, maybe even easier, because, Jesus is very, at least we like to think, very much in those things, and he is, but
Yes.
but he is the prize. Yeah, that's really great. So I'd love to ask you this question, since you're the Old Testament guy, because I run into this quite a bit, and I know that others do as well. So what's your answer to the law, Torah, the first 5 books? There's the 10 commandments, right? But then there's also 613, if you count them up, different rules or ways, that God calls us to live by, or for them to live by. How do we know which ones are applicable today, appropriate for today, and which ones aren't? Because I feel like that's so much of the tension sometimes, is how do we wrestle with what's contained in those first 5 books?
Yeah, it's an ongoing question that I get asked, both because of what I do, and just because it's pretty common and maybe in an increasing way, for some Christians to be attracted to like Hebrew roots kind of movements, which are trying to actually inculcate the keeping of Old Testament laws and rituals and holy days in the lives of Christians today. So it's a question that comes up quite a bit. And one of the things I usually start with an analogy. I'll say, okay, if you're a U.S. citizen, are you under the laws of Canada? Well, no, of course not, because those Canadian laws. I'm a U.S. citizen, so I'm not under those laws. However, is it against the law in Canada to murder? Well, yeah, of course. Yeah. Is it against the law in U.S. to murder? Well, yes, of course. But again, I'm not under that Canadian law, even though it's exactly the same as the law in the United States, right? These are different countries, different law systems, even though there's parallels between these. It's kind of like that with the Old and New Covenant. So are there laws in the Old Covenant that are mirrors of the laws that you see, for instance, reflected in Paul's epistles? Well, yeah. I mean, the Old Covenant says you shouldn't be going out murdering people or committing adultery or stealing. And you also find these same things reiterated in Paul's writings. So there's certainly going to be overlaps. But keep in mind that just like a U.S. citizen is not under Canadian laws, so we as New Covenant Christians are not under, and I want to say this, and I want to make sure people hear me clearly, we are not under any Old Testament laws, in as much as they are Old Covenant laws. Okay? Now, are there Old Covenant laws which remain in effect? These kind of moral laws or universal laws? Yeah. Things like don't steal and don't commit adultery and don't murder. Those continue to be in effect. They were instantiated in the Old Testament laws under that covenant, but they supersede. They're more expansive than just under that covenant. But there's also things that were under the Old Covenant that were just for the people of Israel, and they're never reiterated as things that we are to keep as New Testament Christians. Things like the Sabbath day, or not wearing mixed clothing or eating kosher or those kinds of things. Those were only given to the people of Israel and not to anyone else. And so, what's the 2 main laws, we might say, that New Testament Christians are to follow? Oh, it's real simple. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. That's it. You get those two down, and you got it made. That really is what we as Christians are called to do. Those are the laws. Love God, love your neighbor. Now, the way this looks, of course, you can give particulars. Do you love your neighbor by taking care of him or by murdering him? Well, obviously by taking care of him. Do you love your spouse by being faithful to her or by committing adultery? Of course, by being faithful to her. So anyway, that's in general the way I look at difference between the Old Testament, New Testament laws. That's good.
When you look at Old Testament, I'm just curious, and this maybe changes for you over the years, but as of right now, like I want the underrated and the overrated from like the Old Testament's character or story that we ought to be like, the one we ought to be talking about more that's underrated, and the one that we maybe talk about too much that's overrated, or maybe we just miss. What do you got there?
Yeah. Oh, that's a great question. I mean, there's so many I think that are underrated. For instance, and this might say more about me than I want people to know, but I like the book of Judges. It's like this dark ages of the Old Testament, a lot of R-rated stuff in there, but I actually like it because I find the people there they're real people. I mean, these are people with real struggles. And so, for instance, I love the story of Gideon. I wish we spent more time in Judges 6-9 learning about Gideon, who was a guy that he didn't have a lot going for him, but God still chose him. He struggled so much with fear. God had to keep reassuring him until he finally did what God wanted him to do. And then when all was said and done, he messed up big time. And he led Israel into idolatry. Well, there you go. It's not that human nature. I mean, God uses you and you mess up, and God forgives you and continues to use you. So, I mean, Gideon is one example of an underrated story. As far as one that we hear maybe too much about, well, that's a good question. Maybe Joseph. How's that for one? Even though I'm currently writing a book on Joseph.
That's not a great sales strategy for.
Yeah, let me explain why. Or let me finesse that answer. So I think that we hold Joseph up too much as this great hero.
Okay.
And I think that Joseph has his own issues. And I think that we have so kind of lionized him, sainted him, that we kind of pass over some glaring examples of where this guy has issues.
Yeah.
And so the more that we tend to overlook the weaknesses of some of these, saints in the Old Testament. And what I want us to do is to treat them like they're our next door neighbor. Well, if your next door neighbor was saying these sorts of things or doing these sorts of things, would you think they were such saintly, wonderful people? I mean, if they were raising your taxes to 25%, would you think they were awesome? Which is what Joseph did. They were basically enslaving all of Egypt during a famine. Would you be like, yeah, no, that guy, he's totally righteous? I don't think that you would be.
But it's great leadership, right? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of other examples we could give, but so I'm fine with spending time in the life of Joseph. It's a fascinating story, but let's be real about who he really is. And anyway, that's what I'm doing.
No, that's funny. And I've probably said something to the effect of, really the only negative thing about Joseph is like he was just kind of a punk and brash when he was young to his bros. Like outside of that, he did great. But I'm curious to look at it more in light of what you're writing.
I totally get why they threw him in a well.
Right. Yeah.
Oh yeah, definitely.
All right. So I feel like out of all the Old Testament characters, correct me if I'm wrong, or what you might think, the one that like, I don't know, is there a flaw is Joshua.
Yeah. The only time that Joshua ever receives any kind of mild rebuke is, remember after the whole Jericho debacle when you had all the stuff stolen by Achan?
Yeah.
And then they don't know about Achan yet, but the very next day there's this little bitty place called Ai. And they're like, we don't need very many guys. Go over there and, beat those guys up. Well, the people of Ai beat them up. And then when this happens, Joshua is like, oh, this woe is me. Oh, God, you've abandoned us. What's going on? And God basically says, shut up. Listen, here's the issue. You guys didn't do what I said. You stole some of the stuff from Jericho. So outside of that incident, where you kind of have a Joshua doing a woe is me prayer. Yeah, the rest of his life, he's
pretty good dude.
He's a cut above the rest, for sure.
But that's what I do love about the Old Testament and the New Testament too. Yeah, like you said, I think we idolize these guys, we romanticize it. We look at it with rose-colored glasses, and each one of them, some more than others in the scriptures, we get to see. And that's the beautiful piece about discipleship, right? That's even on the cover with Jacob. Like, this is messy discipleship. It's not easy. We make it a mess, and he cleans us up over and over and over again. All right, one final question on Old Testament. You wrote another book called The Christ Key. I heard you talk a little bit about this at a conference. And I think sometimes we struggle to recognize Jesus in the Old Testament. It's obviously very clear in the New Testament and the Gospels. Like, it's pretty easy to see Jesus in that. But what can we learn, or what do we learn about Jesus specifically in the Old Testament that really does impact our discipleship today?
Yeah, a lot I can say. Let me hone in though on one thing that I find when I teach and present on this, that I find is most helpful to people, and that is, most people understand that Christ was prophesied in the Old Testament, and people get that, and most people understand that there are types and foreshadowings of Jesus. People like Adam and David and Melchizedek and others. What most people are really surprised by, in a good way, is when I talk about how Christ isn't just foreshadowed and prophesied, but he's actually present there. Now, we talked about Jacob and him wrestling. I see multitude of examples where the Son of God is appearing in some sort of visual form in the Old Testament. He appears sometimes as the Word of God, not just a thing you hear, but like a visual word. He does that when he appears to, for instance, Abraham in Genesis 15 and leads him outside. He does that when he appears to young Samuel at the tabernacle. Now, that, of course, ties in with John 1, right? In the beginning was the Word.
Yeah.
Well, and this Word wasn't just with God, and Word wasn't just God, but this Word actually came to the people of Israel in a multitude of different occurrences. He's also the messenger, which is usually, in my opinion, mistranslated, or at least misleadingly translated as angel. The Hebrew for messenger is malach, and that's just what it means. It doesn't mean angel, it means a messenger. So Christ is the messenger of the Father. He appears to Hagar in Genesis 16. He appears to Moses in the burning bush. He appears in a lot of other situations. I understand that to be the Son of God. He sometimes appears as wisdom or as the glory of God. All these ways the New Testament talks about Jesus, the Old Testament talks about this one from God appearing, speaking to people, and actually being called God in those situations. So we have this full-blown Trinitarian theology that's already there in the Old Testament. It's just presented in a way we don't always recognize it. So what I will do is I'll point to John 1:18. No one has seen God at any time, but the only begotten God, who's in the bosom of the Father, has made him known, has revealed him. The Greek there is like he's exegeted him, he's interpreted him. So when you go back with that understanding to the Old Testament, a lot of what we call theophanies in the Old Testament, appearances of God, I would call Christophanies, appearances of Christ. And then when you have that understanding, all of a sudden, all these places where God appears in the Old Testament, if you understand these to be the Son of God appearing, man, that changes things, because you realize that he's been Emmanuel from the beginning. He's always been with his people, always traveling with them, always speaking to them, always instructing them, always disciplining them, but never, ever leaving them, always sticking by them through thick and through thin.
And is that the main, if you could summarize, and maybe there's multiple, but if you could summarize like all of the Christophany ways in which he shows up in the Old Testament, is there a common thread that kind of brings all of them together, or something we really learn or get identified with in that moment?
Yeah, one of the things that almost always happens is that when he appears, he's going to speak a word of comfort and a word of hope. So when we first meet him, Genesis 16, it's Hagar. She's not an Israelite. She's pregnant. She's on the run. She's at the end of her rope. And it's then that I would argue the Son of God appears to her, and he provides a promise to her and presence with her and gives her the kind of consolation that she needs. Moses in the burning bush, same kind of situation. God cares about his people. He speaks to Moses. He sends Moses to redeem them. So when God shows up, when the Son of God shows up in these circumstances, he's there as a reassurance. He's there to give people something to do, and he's there to give them a word of hope and comfort.
That's cool. And obviously in the incarnation, like magnified, right?
Mhm.
Comfort and hope, and then a whole nother level of things. So amazing. Hey, Chad, we ask all our guests, I want you to challenge our listeners if there's one thing practically that they can do this week to be a greater disciple of Jesus, what would you challenge them to do?
2 challenges. I would challenge them, first of all, to pick a book of the Bible, pick a short book of the Bible, and read it or listen to it once a day for an entire week. Most of the Bible can be read or listened to most of the books of the Bible can be read or listened to in less than an hour, most of them in 30 minutes or less. So carve out 30 minutes and pick a book. Maybe it's one of Paul's epistles, maybe it's a short book from the Old Testament, and just spend time in that book, say 30 minutes a day. Get to know it really well. That's the one challenge. The second challenge is to whoever it is, your friend, your neighbor, a complete stranger, to strike up a conversation and bring up religion, bring up church, and use that opportunity to tell them your story about the impact that Christ has made on your life. And then that leads you to a chance to tell them about who he is for them as well.
That's cool. I love it, Chad. So listeners, if you take that challenge, #RedLetterDisciple, let's get into a book and let's share the good news through our stories. All right, Chris, what you got on the way out for Chad here today?
So Chad, every week our talented group of writers come up with a game, but this week they did not. In fact, the people of Jeopardy came up with this game for you today.
Oh, wow.
So this is what we're going to do. Chad, we're going to say that you just finished the second round of Jeopardy. You have $10,000. The final question, the final Jeopardy question is on the Old Testament. How much of the 10,000 would you like to wage?
9,999.
There we go. Okay, he's gonna have $1 in his pocket if he messes this up.
Is this a real Jeopardy question?
Real Jeopardy. This is a real final Jeopardy question.
Okay.
Based on the Old Testament. It was said by the great Alex Trebek 7 years ago.
Come on.
Here we go. Consisting of 21 verses, the book of this minor prophet, whose name means servant of God, is the shortest.
What is Obadiah?
Yeah, you got it.
Basically, I got my money.
Zach's going to send you a check for, what was it? $19,999.
Oh, nice. Yeah, take that vacation I've been wanting.
Yeah, this ended up being more costly than I imagined. But
it was interesting because the 3 contestants, one contestant said Joel, one said Malachi, and the other one said Esau.
Which speaks to the maybe not style's too strong for that, but immature theology. We need more of it. We need more guys like you, Chad, to spread the news.
Man, he didn't miss a beat either. He was on it. That was child's play.
There you go. Chad, if people want to connect with you, where can they find you?
Well, if they're on social media, you can just search for me. I'm on all social media apps: Facebook, Instagram, X, TikTok. I have material on all those. Or if you're a website kind of guy, just go to 1517.org. I mean, you can search my name there. Articles, videos, podcast, all kinds of stuff there.
You have like 600 articles on there. Now
I've written a few things.
I'm gonna say
he got stuck a lot of times in the truck.
That's right. That's right.
He's waiting on bulldozers a long time, but he's had all the time in the world. So.
Yeah.
Hey man, grateful for you and your story. Thanks for helping a lot of people. Well, take care, Chad.
All right, you guys too. Thanks.
Man, Chad is so smart, and his books are incredible. If you've never read one, he just writes with a really fabulous talent, and from a depth that I think is sometimes missing. So check out Chad Bird and all the books that he has and all the articles and any of the links that we talked about. Plus, you can connect with our partner, Hope Chest, at redletterpodcast.com. That's where you'll find the show notes, all in episode 96. And we'd love for you to link in with our partner, Hope Chest, to get in the global game. And they've got some vision trips coming up so you can learn more there. Next week, I'm pretty pumped to bring Grant Skeldon onto the show. Grant is a next-gen expert on discipleship, and so he talks about how older and younger generations can do discipleship together. Plus, the prosperity gospel has been something that's been talked about a whole lot over the past couple of decades, especially. But he's also recognizing and realizing that what's motivating younger generations is maybe it is prosperity a little bit, but maybe there's something else. And so we talk about some competing gospels, two other ones that we need to watch out for that maybe are a little harder to detect than the prosperity gospel. You're not going to want to miss it. And so don't miss it. And you won't miss it by subscribing to the podcast or following it on whatever your favorite platform is. And so we'll see you back next week for the next episode of Red Letter Disciple.